So what we really need for seminary classes is a class on Canva.
That's right.
I want that to be the first thing the YouTube viewers hear when they look back. I know you were going to go for the whole intro, but
welcome to the Church in Context podcast. We're going to give a couple minutes to those who want to join live. So if you want us, if you're rewatching this, you can go ahead and miss this important conversation and just catch the countdown video, and that's when we'll start. We're talking about how much of seminary is relevant. Okay, true or false? This is controversial. Going to culinary school would make you a more effective youth pastor than going to seminary. What do you say?
So
is that too far?
No. So here's what I'm going to say.
Okay.
So we were talking about how some of seminary is really centered around things that aren't a huge part of everything you need to know for ministry. But I actually think that going to culinary school would have a negative effect, because there's no way I could study culinary snacks and then put half of our youth snacks in my mouth ever. If I knew how bad they were, if I understand how terrible the flavor combinations were for chili ranch flavored Funyuns, I don't know if I'd ever do it. So
that is actually a really good point. My sister went to culinary school, and shout out if she ever watches this. She's a manager at a restaurant. But it kind of ruined her doing culinary school, because they gave her all the finest ingredients that none of us can afford, right? So learning how to make the filet mignon, the souffles, all these incredible dishes. But when it came to practical home cooking, she doesn't cook for herself, because she's only used to these incredible ingredients, mushrooms that are super expensive and steak and all this kind of stuff. So she eats more fast food than the rest of us because of that. So I just find that really interesting. So that's a good point. The youth ministry budget probably couldn't handle you going to culinary school.
Probably not. I had that conversation once. It didn't go very well. Anyways, I don't want to talk about it. It's a sore point.
Okay. Right.
Yep. Yeah, but on the topic of, since people might be here they might want to hear what happens backstage. I will say, just in regards to our intro, one of my highlights of my week is always throwing some kind of curveball on our intros. I don't know if you realize that. I do it every week. I say something weird right as we start the podcast just to make you react to it. It's really fun. So that's why it's good that you always say the first words, because then I get to throw something in there. If you ever wonder, you're wow, it looks like they have these nice pre-planned intros where Jonah just says something not off kilter, but it'll just be I don't know, something. There's never a pre-plan. John always just has to react.
Jonah's I feel like his whole life is just kind of off kilter, so that kind of makes sense. Yeah,
I am a very off the top kind of person, so that's probably why I never plan out our intros. Yeah,
that's perfect. Love it.
Yeah, but I like when their first impression to the podcast for people listening for the first time is just complete and utter chaos and confusion. That's what I want them to walk into this with. Yeah,
which is ministry, which is youth ministry. A lot of our topics, right, are centered around that.
True, that is true. I guess a fair amount of our and hey, you know what else is chaotic, John? The world. But how can God be unchanging in that ever-changing world? To re-trailer it, that's what we're talking about today.
Wow, and why don't we talk about that after our countdown right now?
Exactly.
We will see you on the other side. I'm feeling real quick. Let's do a fun countdown.
Oh, fun fact. We brought down my favorite countdown last week. Part of the midway turn to youth group. And,
did it?
Yeah, youth group 11 in person. We did it last night. It was really awkward. It was really awkward in person, but it's fine.
Well, let's bring it back right now, because we have it.
Really?
We have it. Yeah.
It's such a long countdown.
We'll be back on the other side of the countdown.
Party llama. party llama, makes a party llama, brings a party llama, is the party llama party. To the party llama. Party llama makes a party llama, brings a party llama, is the party llama party. Strobe lights, cool hats, disco ball, ice skates if applicable, sunglasses inside, pizza delivered to your door, Capri Sun, bags of kids, variety of assorted dips, to the party llama, to the party llama, to the party llama. Stop, llama time. Party llama knows how to party.
All right, welcome to the Church in Context podcast. My name is John. I'm here with the official host of the show, Jonah. Jonah, how are you today?
I'm doing dandy. For those who are watching on YouTube, we just listened to my favorite song called Party Llama. It is a song that only exists because youth ministry exists.
That is right. Party Llama is a classic way that Jonah and I, when we were working on staff together, we would kind of torture the students who are watching YouTube Live with us. So I decided to bring it back to YouTube Live today. You know, speaking of that, this is kind of funny. And for those listening after, you can't see this, but actually a gift from a student in response to that was this actual pink llama right here. I have to go back.
Wow.
It has a head. I'm going to put this up to the mic so our listeners can kind of hear this like, oh yeah, it is an actual like moving llama that is pink with yellow and blue feet.
And an extremely orange face.
Yes, that's right.
Like, wow, that's orange.
It's bigger than I thought it was too, pulling it out. Yeah. All right, but that is the party llama right there. Yes. Wow. Well, we are back after a couple week layoff, and it has been a busy and eventful semester. Yeah, but so super excited to be back. We're talking about how God works in the midst of change. But first off, I want to give a shout out to Student Connection, as usual, our unofficial sponsor, who, has given us this platform. So thanks, Student Connection. They're planning an in-person event for November and podcasts being released soon. Jonah, have you seen if that podcast is officially released yet?
I'm not sure. I don't exactly know, but if you want more information on Student Connection, they have a website. I think some other information can also be found through the Mission Connection website, if I'm not mistaken. But if you look up Student Connection on Google or Bing, you can find out about them. They've got an online presence. You can look them up to hear more about their events or about their podcasts.
All right, very nice. I'm looking at their website, and so far we're on their website as their live podcast.
Wow.
They don't have their official podcast yet, but it's coming.
Yeah, I believe it was planned for May originally.
It was May. Okay,
it's going to be coming soon. We're recording this in late April.
That's right, coming soon. Well, speaking of just kind of news, things coming up, I want to talk about some odd and peculiar news. Some things that just kind of struck you as weird or different. There's a lot of options to choose from. And Jonah, do you have something for us today?
Oh, yes. Yeah, 100%. This one does not start with Florida Man, by the way. I went on a streak where a lot of them did, but this is just some random guy. So apparently a groom went to the wrong wedding. He went to the wrong wedding place, and he nearly married a stranger in Indonesia. I mean, being married and who you marry is a really important decision. And of all the things you could potentially almost get wrong, that is probably, it's up there with the worst.
Wow. So many questions. First off, how did he get the wrong location?
GPS error, I think.
GPS error? Are you serious?
Yeah.
That makes so much sense to me now. Oh, man. Google Maps. Oh, leads to destroy lives, people. Make sure you check.
And I would say by and large, the stereotype seems to be that the groom cares less about like the details of the wedding than the bride, and that's the natural result of that, right? Is like he's just gonna show up in a tux and get married. He doesn't know where it is or when it is or why it is or who's gonna be there. He's just there to have a good time. So,
I have a funny story about that. So, for my wedding, we had like balloons. Like our thing was like releasing balloons into the air as we walked away. And when I showed up, I was one of the first persons to show up, just because I didn't have to do much to get ready. All the balloons that were helium, they were like on the ground, like they lost their helium, and we bought them before. I know, so I had to go to like a grocery store and get all these balloons like hours before my wedding. So, yeah, I can kind of see that, although I showed up at the right place. The other question is, though, did he end up going back to his original wedding? Like, did his bride and everyone else, did they feel like he was standing her up? And what about the groom? Last question, what about the groom going to the location of the accident? Where was he? Why was he late? There's just so many things that came together at the wrong time for this.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's just a lot of stories.
There's a lot of moving parts and big mistakes.
Yes, exactly. Reminds me a lot of the Jacob and Leah and Rachel story, right?
Yeah,
totally. Man, hopefully he didn't have to wait 7 years after that one. For mine, okay, so this is kind of a big news story we haven't talked about yet, but this has happened earlier this month. Was the big ship that blocked the Suez Canal over in Egypt, right? And how that really affected the world's trade, because what happens, so you guys are familiar with the Bible story where people of Israel crossing the Red Sea. Well, there's a connection there that connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean and kind of Australia and even China over there. They don't have to go all the way down south around South Africa, where there's not only a lot of bad weather for ships, it's way longer, but there's also pirates that can, take over ships, that kind of thing. It's a big deal, this trade. And what has happened, it's affected the global economy, even though that they're free after however long it was, like a week or something. But because of that, and because of materials, there's actually a shortage of garden gnomes. This is actually like a real thing. Like there's not enough garden gnomes right now. The supply is low and the demand is high, and there's just not enough. I mean, we can talk about things like global vaccine shortages, but this is almost maybe as important. I don't know what to do. Yeah, I mean,
what do the people of Portland do? I feel like Portland is kind of a garden gnome central.
I feel like that's true. I'm not totally sure. It could change the culture. You know what I think could happen? How about garden llamas? Right.
Hey, there we go.
I'm feeling that's a new thing. So
yeah, sometimes, John, things happen and we have to change to adapt to them, because sometimes the world has changed and we just have to kind of roll with the punches.
Really? Is that so? That was quite the transition for our topic today. We are talking about how God is unchanging and what that means for us in a very chaotic and changing world. Wow. Jonah, you've experienced some change. um, both, wow, in just every area of your life, pretty much.
Basically.
I mean, you're still in that one random room with all the random items, so that hasn't changed. That's good.
Mm-hmm. It's true. I've not left this room in
Yeah.
months. I'm trapped here. Please send help.
He's got a white wall behind him, and it's just like a void. So that's where Jonah exists right now.
For those watching on video, I'm blinking. Help me. Anyways, so yeah, there's been a lot of big changes. Those who have been listening to the podcast every week, you've probably followed along this kind of mini saga that we've talked about before and after the show, where we talk about how my retreats never seem to happen. Luckily, the series of like changing retreats changed in and of itself. So I had a big change in my life was that my retreat stopped changing, and I could actually do one of them. So just this last weekend, we were able to have our high school retreat. It was a really good time, but it kind of reminded me, yeah, a lot of things in my job this year, a lot of things in my life have just undergone really quick, really rapid changes, from Oregon catching on fire to Oregon freezing over and us having major power outages,
Yes.
to the virus impacting different families and different communities that I know. To me, moving from Canada to Oregon, it feels like recently life has just been crazy. And
Totally.
oftentimes it's really easy for me to feel like I'm just over my head, like everything is totally out of my control. Because by and large, a lot of those things were out of my control.
Yeah, that's good. I'm so glad you finally got to have a retreat, one that's very highly modified because you students technically had to go home after each night. But you got to have it, which is fantastic, despite stuff freezing over, despite COVID affecting like not only just like how society functions and that kind of canceling retreats, but really twice having like personal like contact tracing kind of moments where you had to actually postpone retreats because of that, like personal interaction. So yeah, I'm grateful that you finally got to have your retreat, and and everyone came home safe, like all the students.
I'm not the best at counting when it's past 10, but I think so. We got most of them at least.
You know,
Most of the students.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Good. At least 90% of the students who came made it back home safely. So not bad.
90% is an A-, and that's considered excellent in school. So I think that's a job well done. Yeah, there's just been a ton of change, and even since the beginning of this podcast back in October of 2020, for really just the past couple of years, there's been a significant amount of change, just kind of globally, kind of on the national spectrum. It's just we can't keep up with it, feels like, and just for so many of us, change has been kind of the norm. And it's almost like, you mentioned like planning a retreat. It's almost like you plan something, but you kind of have to just expect it to change. So before, at least with me, you'd have like your plan A, but plan B was kind of a concept. Maybe you had something in mind, usually just meant kind of a rescheduling. That might be plan B. But for you, it's like you have to have a solid plan A. Then plan B has to be just as solid as if it's going to happen. And then you still have a plan C and a plan D, right? So it's just constant, the kinds of the change, because it could change week to week. And whether it's the actual virus or circumstances or weather itself that's sudden, or as we've experienced in Oregon, and I'm sure across the US, just different government restrictions. Mm-hmm. Things like being, less restrictive, then more restrictive, then becoming less and becoming more again, and all that kind of stuff. It can change, and you have like 3 days notice.
Yeah.
So that's been intense too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I remember the worst cancellation I had to do for a retreat was 3 hours before we left. I got notice that we wouldn't be able to do it just for some various reasons in our community. So yeah, change happens fast. It's like, what is it? Is it the Nationwide commercials? Life comes at you fast. That's what 2020 and 2021 have felt like. Life comes at you fast. Yeah.
And you know what? Instead of nationwide being on your side, God is on your side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I have a passage just to kind of, it's more like a devotional one. Jonah actually has a passage he's going to read us too from scripture that we're going to more unpack. But just, I want to open with this devotional style passage. And I do want to give the explanation that when you're reading an Old Testament text, you have to be cautious with not necessarily inserting yourself into that exact situation. So in this situation, you have the prophet Isaiah, and he's talking about the people of Israel. And it doesn't mean, you in 2021, that these promises directly apply to you. That's important to realize. But realize that God is unchanging, and some of the principles we can take from the character of God do apply. And as people, part of his church, part of his people, there can be some level of understanding of how God sees us. So this is from Isaiah 43. And this is a prophecy about how Israel is going to go through a lot of changes. And the changes are going to be so significant, they're going to be taken from their land and taken to a place called Babylon. And they're going to be there for 70 years, several generations before they're allowed to come back. So this is what is said in Isaiah 43. This is verses 1 through 4. But now this is what the Lord says. He who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I give Egypt your ransom, Cush and Seba in your stead, since you are precious and honored in my sight, and because I love you. Kind of skipping ahead to verse 16. This is what the Lord says. He who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and horses, the army and reinforcements together. And they lay there, never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. Forget the former things. This is God speaking. Forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. So just the incredible change that they're going through is so intense, but God is there with them, making a new path, a new way.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. Yeah, and sometimes, like when I look back on my life, in moments of big change, I can see now that it was for the better, even if in the moment I didn't see that or I didn't want to see that. That's not to say that, all changes is always going to be good. That's not to say that if you're going through a hard change, that you're not allowed to, feel frustration or to feel, sad or scared with what's happening. But it is to just, I think that there's an important reminder that some of the changes we go through in life can sometimes work out for the best, and we can keep hope in that.
I would take that a little bit further, Jonah. I would say a lot of the changes we go through are necessary, and they are definitely ordained by God in some way. Maybe not. God is in control of all things, but I think some of them are definitely like purposed by God, even if they're hard. I'm going to give some cheesy illustrations if you're ready for this.
Oh yeah, I'm always ready for cheesy illustrations.
Cheesy illustrations from nature. Today's Earth Day, if you guys didn't know that. So that's when we're recording. So we're gonna have some Earth Day illustrations, and Jonah has an actual cheese head, like Packers fan cheese head.
I'm ready for some cheesy illustrations.
Okay, first one is this. You have the idea of a caterpillar going through change. Okay, so caterpillar has to go through that time in the cocoon, that hard and difficult time to come out a butterfly. And this is interesting, is that if there's been like people that are like, oh, I feel sad for the poor caterpillar butterfly that's trying to get out of its cocoon. It's really struggling. And they like open up the cocoon for them. Like they take a little like knife, or they open it open. They open the thing so it opens up. And the butterfly can't struggle to get out of I can't say that word. The cocoon. I'm like, what nationality is that? The butterfly is trying to get out of the cocoon, and part of that is building up its muscles so it can fly. So if you
Mm.
open it up early, then its muscles are underdeveloped. If insects have muscles, whatever that is, its strengths, it's not able to survive on its own because it wasn't going through the struggle. Someone took it out of the struggle.
Hmm.
And how about this illustration? This one will preach right here, okay? A tree needs to go through its own struggles, okay? So there were scientists that took trees and like put them in like a bubble, like a dome, so that way they would not experience the force of the wind and the weatherization that happens to trees that are difficult for it, that appear to slow down its growth. They made the soil perfect. These trees grew faster than ever, but because they were never faced with harsh winds or harsh weather, when it was time to bear fruit, they fell over from the weight of their fruit. So we have to go through trials in order to bear fruit. How about that?
I like it. Yeah, just kind of riffing off that a bit. I remember a couple of years ago, I went to Yosemite, and there was a big conversation about forest fires. I think when I had gone there before, or very recently, there had been a forest fire. They were talking about how a lot of the people who work in the park didn't want to make it impossible for the forest to occasionally catch on fire. Because when one lightning strikes and things start to burn, it actually makes the forest stronger. Trees that were weak get kind of, weeded out for something better. Trees that were strong are kind of allowed to grow, and it's better for the entire forest if occasionally it catches on fire. As weird as that might seem, as backward as it might seem, I think sometimes in our lives when things metaphorically burn, when things go astray, yeah, like you said, it can help us identify areas that we're weak in. It can help us weed that out, and it also gives God, I think, a bigger place in our life sometimes when we have to rely on Him, when He is the only person we can go to. So yeah, I think those are both great analogies, John.
I love it. Love yours too. Those are 3 solid analogies for Earth Day. Love it.
Yep.
All right, Jonah, can you read our text that you brought for our discussion today?
Yeah, for sure. So the passage, we'll get to that maybe later. That might make more sense farther down the line.
Oh, got it.
That's a passage connected to a story. But second thing I want to talk about too is we live in this world that is super changing. I think anybody with eyes can see that, especially this year. That's become super obvious. But the question is how do we how can we say God's unchanging when the world that He made doesn't seem to represent that?
Yeah.
And I think that's a fair argument. I don't think that's a dumb question at all. So many times we can look out in the world and say, Multnomah Falls is beautiful because the God that made it is beautiful. Or we can look and we can say, there's order in creation, and the God that made it must be ordered. So why can we not look at so how can we say God is unchanging when every indication of the world that He made is changing? I don't know, John. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah. First off, you have to remember that God is sovereign. He's above all things. So God exists outside of time, that He created time. So there's all these kind of deep thoughts about who God is. And we have to remember that God is the constant. And while a lot of things are perceived to be changing, there are a lot of things that are not changing. And God is holding all things together. So in our small lives, there's tons of stuff that change. And it's really interesting, especially if we have younger listeners for this podcast. You'll look back and think of some of the significant changes that you went through in junior high and high school. And as you go through bigger and greater changes as an adult, they will seem insignificant in perspective. So, maybe that big giant assignment, oh my goodness, that 3-page English paper is just huge, man. That's massive. And then you get to college for your undergraduate and have to write a 6-page paper. And then maybe you pursue your master's degree and you're writing 10 to 15 pages.
I currently have a 12 and 15-page paper due. So yes, that's the accurate number, John.
So for you, Jonah, if you were assigned a 2 to 3 page paper, you would like kind of wake up. You wouldn't really care. You kind of would read a little bit. You'd type for like probably an hour.
Yeah, I was gonna. What I would probably do with like the papers that freaked me out in high school would be set a timer and like go for a speed run. Honestly, three pages, 3 pages. I could. Yeah, I think I could crush it in like I don't know, maybe 40 minutes if I was really on my game.
Yeah, that's good. As far as God's unchangingness too, and just kind of putting that in perspective, I like to throw back to this verse, Malachi 3:6. Once again, talking about the people of Israel. God says, I, the Lord, do not change, so you, the descendants of Jacob, are not destroyed. So just this idea that God is unchanging and he is faithful to keep his promises, because quite frankly, if God did change, he would have wiped out humanity a long time ago because of our sinfulness. But God's love for us is so consistent. God is a consistent presence in our life when, quite frankly, no other person can be that consistent. We might think like maybe our parents are consistent or a mentor at church is consistent or something else, but the reality is only God is unchanging and that reliable. He's the foundation that holds everything together.
Yeah, and in the same way that we can look and see how much nature changes, there's also so many things that are just constant.
Yeah.
I think of things like 1 plus 2. That's 2 no matter where, or 1 plus 1 is 2. No matter where in the world you are, no matter where in the universe, that is the same. Things like no matter where you're at on Earth, gravity. There's these constant forces that we always have in our lives, the laws of nature, these kind of unchangeable things. And when I read passages like that, I think, what if God was just a little bit off about the way that like an electron moved around, the nucleus of an atom? How would that change everything? We worship a God that is unbelievably consistent. And nature does, by and large, reflect that. Yes, there are random things that happen. Yes, we live in a fallen, broken world where things aren't going to be how we think they are all the time. But also there's, like you said earlier, so many things God is very delicately and intentionally holding together. And I think, that's just important to note that if he stopped doing that if we worshiped a God that wasn't changing, we couldn't have like a law of nature. We couldn't have, certain laws about like the relative, laws of relativity, speed of light, these things that are this constant throughout the universe could not exist if we didn't worship an unchanging God.
That's fantastic. Yeah. You think of, wow, lots of things, you mentioned like weather patterns, but you can rely on the sun rising every day. You can rely on the seasons changing. You can rely on the fact that the Detroit Lions are never going to win the Super Bowl. That's just a fact. Sure. That is reliable.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, just lots of consistent things in the midst of our change, and they're much bigger than ourselves. That's kind of the consistent thing, is that so many things in our lives change, but there are consistent patterns that hold true and will continue to be true.
And I think as we think about how God's unchanging, sometimes when we go through big changes in our lives, when there are big changes in the world, we realize what it really means for God to never change. It's not just something that we tack on to God. It's something that is inherent to his being, and actually can be a really big source of comfort when the world is changing. One thing I talk to my students about on our retreat is this idea that our plans for the retreat had to change a lot, but we couldn't do it overnight. We couldn't do it when we normally do it at the same time of year. We didn't have kids that maybe would have gone there in past years. There was different people, different things were involved, but what was the same is that we were there to worship the same God who's going to show up the same as he had in past years.
Yeah.
And that God was still there with us, unchanging, even in a world that looks so different. So I think God being unchanging means a lot more when we look and see the changes that we have to go through in the world.
That's good. That's really good. And I just want to reiterate the point that we have to go through change. That is part of the Christian life. You think of these examples from let's just say the example from the Old Testament, the people of Israel who were in Egypt. You could argue, especially with how they acted in the wilderness time, that they did not want to leave Egypt. They did not want to change. But God had something better for them on the other side. And something about our lives that's true. As far as rhythms that we have to go through, there are times in our lives where it's called orientation, where we are solid, where we're in our house, we're comfortable, things are kind of normal. There's a rhythm, there's a pattern. And then there's deorientation, and that's a time that we really grow and we mature through that. And then there's a reorientation time. And that's when we kind of get adjusted to new things. There's these patterns, these seasons that we go through. And part of that is essential for maturity. And I would say for those of you listening who are Christians, call themselves Christians and are part of the church, that part of your faith development, you have to go through changes. You have to go through trials, and you have to be able to grasp and re-grasp these deep things of God. And change is absolutely essential, as hard as it is and as difficult as it is. And maybe you can't see the purpose in it, but there is a purpose. And part of that is learning to trust in God and have faith in him.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. I'm a big part of our walk of discipleship and becoming more like Jesus involves us changing, right?
Yeah.
Karl Barth has this quote where he says, God creates something out of nothing. Amazing, you say, and it is, but more amazing still, God creates a saint out of a sinner. In our lives, as we become more like Jesus, there will be things that we leave behind. There will be changes that we undergo. Our lives will look different if they look more like Jesus. And so I guess accepting that, acknowledging that, and almost being excited for some of the changes we go through. It's just a part of discipleship. It's a part of growing up in faith. I think a really important part as well. Paul talks a lot about how we are a new creation in Christ. The old is gone, the new has come. I like how he says we're a new creation, then specifies the old is gone, the new has come.
Yeah.
He makes it clear something is new in you. So live as though something is new. You may have always found some comfort in that, in knowing that the problems I'm going through now might not stick around for forever. The things in me that are broken can be changed. In the same way that our world can undergo big changes, God can also bring about big changes in those who follow him and those who want to be like Jesus.
Yeah.
And there's something comforting about changes as well. God might be unchanging, but we are able to become more like him. We're able to grow closer towards him, to grow in him. And that's just something beautiful. So, yeah. Awesome. So, we talked a lot about how we live in a changing world, how we worship an unchanging God, and that it does make a big difference that God is unchanging. It's part of his character. It's part of how we can live our lives as believers in pursuit of him. But I also think it's important to talk a little bit about how we can actually live in an unchanging world. And as usual, I'm a bad example of this. This is a story from the first time I had ever led a D group, discipleship group at college. John's heard the story probably a million times. At this point, the story happened when I had to preach on James 4:13-15, which says this: Now listen, all who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why do you not even know what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. So I had to preach on that passage, and I thought to myself, what cool analogy or what cool visual picture can I give the people in my D group that our plans might not work out how they thought so. So I'm curious, John, what would you have done in this situation? What would your a picture have been? Do you have any ideas?
Can you restate that question?
Reading through James, 4:13-15 about everything changing in the world, what would your analogy have been? Do you have any good ideas or things that you would do if you were leading a team through this passage?
Oh man, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of ways you can go with it, right? Maybe you could have them put their problems or their plans on a cross or something, right? That's a classic one. You could have had them throw it into the wind or something, right? I decided to burn my group's hopes and dreams. So I had them write down on a piece of paper what they wanted to do for the future.
Wow.
And we went to our campus fire pit, and we burned them to ashes. Some of them said things like, I want to pursue Jesus with my life. And I was like, can I burn this? But catching stuff on fire was fun, so I think they threw it in. It was not the best analogy. I don't think living in a changing world means that we never make plans.
Yes.
I think that I kind of missed something there. I don't think it means that we live our lives just day to day because things can change. I think it means something different. So, anyways, that's my bad analogy of how we can live.
That's so funny.
In a changing world. Yeah. Yeah.
I love bad youth group analogies. Those are the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm curious, John, what do you think we can do as believers? How can we live in this unchanging world? What are things we can do that are wise, that are good? How can we react to living in a world that changes?
I think a big thing is not losing perspective, realizing how big we are compared to how big God is, how big our circumstances are compared to how big the movement of the gospel is. And just keeping things in perspective, that our goal is not what's best for us and what makes us feel good, but what's best for God's plan, and being able to submit to that. I think, man, just a big thing, and this goes back to a couple episodes ago with Dr. Ron Frost, but thinking about, what do you love the most? I really think that will sincerely impact how you navigate change. And I think change can happen in our lives when our priorities are not in the right place. For example, here's a tough one for some of our listeners. If you really, really are into sports, maybe to the point of it is something you find your identity in, and then the pandemic happens and sports are canceled or postponed forever. I think I just saw posts a couple weeks ago about volleyball seasons wrapping up in April, right? And you just have different things happening. I'm not even sure what basketball looks like, just those kinds of things. And people losing their identities, some athletes taking a full year off, choosing to opt out. And change can challenge what we love the most. And be thinking about that. Like, if you're going through significant change, how is that affecting what you like the most? Maybe it has to do with health. Gosh, going back to the athlete analogy, I've heard of so many stories where athletes will including high school, will blow their knee out because that's been such a big part of their lives, and that injury can change their perspective on things. Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a college you wanted to get into, or a job you wanted to have, or maybe a job you do have and a job you loved and you lost that, or you lost a friend. I would say, in a season of change, make God the thing that you love the most. I think we all struggle with that. I think we struggle with loving ourselves more than we love God. And when that happens, change is not only going to be rough, but I think it's going to come more often for you. So keep that in mind. Love the God who is unchanging.
True. Yeah, and just this last weekend for a tweet, we went over what is maybe my least favorite book of the Bible. We went over the book of Jonah. But I think we have this cool picture in Jonah too, where Jonah's life is kind of full of constant changes. The book moves really fast. Jonah's only 4 chapters, and it is jam-packed with things that are happening. Jonah hears God's call to go to Nineveh, and he immediately goes to Joppa to go to Tarshish, right? He's out of there right away. But then God sends a storm, and God sends a whale, and Jonah's forced to sit with who he is, with who God is, and he's forced to remember God's mission for him. And Jonah's prayer in the whale is far from perfect. A lot of scholars will debate that, but I do think what we see in the book of Jonah is that when he's forced to take some time to sit, when his plan doesn't work out, he at least goes and does what God had told him to do in the beginning. He has a time of refocusing. And I think in the book of Jonah, we see this a person whose plans got dashed, and it led towards God doing something amazing. The conversion that happens in Nineveh because of Jonah is insane. Literally, chickens and cows put on sackcloth and ashes. What? And it only happens because God dashes Jonah's plans to make way for his plans.
And that is that orientation, deorientation, reorientation process, right? Because so Jonah was a very successful, let's say, prophet in Israel. And then deorientation, well, he gets swallowed by a fish. That's pretty, it's going to shake your orientation, right? And then reorientation in the place where God wants him. And, he didn't exactly have the best attitude, in reading the text throughout that, but that's that process. And just realize that it's part of life. And I think in that case of Jonah really loved God more than his own will. And you have to look at and be sympathetic with Jonah in that story, is that he was ministering to the people of Assyria who led away his people on fish hooks in their mouth and abused them. So there's a good reason why he didn't want to share God's love with those people. Nineveh was not just a random town. They were pretty horrible sinners. But if he had just been obedient to God, I think his deorientation phase, let's call it, would have been a little bit smoother than being thrown overboard and eaten by fish. So, yeah. Yeah,
definitely. And what's cool about Jonah too is we look, and this guy is notably stubborn. It's there throughout the book. He runs away. He doesn't even want to tell the sailors until they ask, why he's running away and why the storm might be. I'm pretty sure Jonah knew. He gets to Nineveh. He only walks a day into a 3-day journey of the city, gives a short message, and then people repent, and he's angry about it. Jonah's stubborn all the way through. But somebody had to write the book of Jonah, or somebody had to tell the story of Jonah. No one's there in Jonah 4 except for Jonah and God. So something in Jonah's heart, I think after the text, changes, and he tells this story. Somehow he gets around to letting other people know what he had gone through. I think even Jonah and his stubbornness undergoes a change at some point in his life. And no matter how stubborn you might feel now, we are changing people who worship an unchanging God, but we are changing people, and we are never beyond redemption. We're never beyond grace. We're never beyond God's transforming power in our lives.
That's huge. Good word, Jonah. To the Jonah speaking to me, but also to the prophet Jonah.
There we go. Mm-hmm.
I think that's been a great discussion, and I think we should quickly wrap it up here. Hey, Jonah, what's been something that is significant in your life, something that you can't get over this week?
Well, I think we had talked about one before the show, but one thing that has been kind of seriously on my heart is what's happening in Myanmar. For those who don't know, there's a civil war happening there, and I happen to have a friend that I go to seminary with whose wife and daughter are there. It's just a really tricky situation. I think I talked about it before on the podcast, but lately that's just really been on my heart. Just for the people who are there, people who, through no fault of their own, are in constant danger.
Yes.
That's just a terrible situation that really needs prayer. So if you're hearing this, if you've listened all the way through, if you could be praying for Myanmar and for my friend, I'd really appreciate it.
And I know it helps me to have a kind of a visual of where some place is. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is Myanmar, is that over by like Thailand and Vietnam?
Yeah, I believe so. It's if you've heard of Burma and Myanmar are the same place.
That would be east of India on your map, south of China. That's where that area is.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, be praying for that. I mean, that's been a heavily conflicted area. If you think of the Vietnam War and all that kind of stuff too, that happened several decades ago. That's huge. I'm going to keep mine short. Just the shorter I keep it, I think the better. But just pray for our country too. Just this past month, it seems like every day there is some kind of mass shooting, and I don't know why that's happening, why that's connected. People are out more, or people are frustrated more. I am not sure of the connection, but why that's happening. But it just seems like it's, we've had like it severely reduced this issue for the past year, and suddenly that's crept up again. And just all the different things happening with the different trials and police issues and all that's coming up. Just, I'd say, be informed on the issue, and be praying. There's a lot of people who are hurting right now, and a lot of big decisions being made, both with our civil leaders and our judges and that kind of thing. So just be keeping all that in prayer. It's significant. And you think of change, I think our country's going through a big one right now. And pray that God would be glorified in it. Our country is not, necessarily like this Christian thing going through a Christian change, but it's going through change, and the change is going to affect all of us who are within this country. So keep leaning on God, who's unchanging.
Yeah.
And with that said, we'll go ahead and wrap up for this week. Jonah, thank you for being here since October, inviting me onto your podcast. That's been Unchanging. And for everyone who's listening, I hope you guys have a fantastic week. And break.
Cool. Don't know if we have anyone in the comments, but yeah.
Cool.
Sweet. All right. Yeah. Should we end the broadcast?
Yeah, let's do that. Sounds
Cool.
good.